Okay. Right, so I'm just going to make sure that I can see everyone and also at the same time see my own screen. I think that's going to work. Okay, and can everyone see the screen? I think I'm going to have to fix that a little bit. There, I think that should be fine. Okay. Just make sure, ooh, having a little difficulty there. Okay, great. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanen'kehá:ka, or Mohawk Nation, where I'm currently located, and the lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples upon which my home institution, Queen's University, is located. I'm mindful of the fact that collectively, without their careful custodianship of the land and waters of Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, the city where I live, and Cataraqui, which is Kingston, the city where I work, since time immemorial, I would not have had the opportunity to speak with you here today. As the descendant of peoples who were enslaved and of people who were enslavers, I am particularly sensitive to the violence of colonialisms and the importance of acknowledging the deep continuities between the injustices of the past and those in the present. For it's only through acknowledgement and accounting for the past that we can begin to imagine and chart paths towards just futures. I'd also like to thank Dr. Sherman and all of you in the geography department for your generous invitation to share my research. It's indeed an honor to be in your company, and I hope that what I have to say will generate and resonate with you and inspire some sort of conversation at the end. Okay, so since about the mid-1990s, policymakers in Europe and North America have become more attuned to the important role that social and solidarity economies, which I will just for short say SSE, the role that they're playing in supporting communities to adapt to uncertainty, vulnerability, and to crisis. And especially after the 2008 financial crisis, when states began to implement austerity programs in the North, the global North, governments realizing how SSEs filled the gap in social provisioning began to build an expanded role for them in their policy agendas. The embrace by Western governments and international aid agencies of this social and solidarity economy has been instrumental to the surge of interest in and support for social and solidarity economy institutions, especially in places like Jamaica, where the state has declared its commitment to driving the growth of this sector. Organizations such as the OECD, the World Bank, USAID, the EU, they're all emerging as key advocates in this global policy shift. But I ask, what does it mean for the architects of neoliberalism to support SSEs? And in particular, the social mission that many now view as crucial to our capacity to respond to many of the complex challenges facing the global economy. Answering this question, I believe, requires a deep knowledge of the social relationships that have historically sustained SSEs over long periods of time, the institutional practices that govern how they function, and importantly, the rationalities that guide them. So in this talk, I shall examine current attempts to support SSEs in Jamaica, and in particular, the emerging policy agenda to promote social enterprise in particular. I have three objectives for this talk. The first is to just examine the popularity of the social enterprise model of development in Jamaica and the assumptions that this emerging policy agenda makes about the social relationships that sustain SSEs. The second is to highlight or to draw attention to the anti-colonial roots of the institutions, social relationships, and practices upon which Jamaica's SSEs are founded. And then the third, to demonstrate how current social enterprise model depoliticizes and potentially threatens the sustainability of social institutions and practices. So I kind of have an argument, and I think I should share it just in case I get lost along the way. And that is, I'm going to argue that Jamaica's social enterprise model of development is founded on market logics that are contrary to many of the principles that have historically sustained its social and solidarity economy. These principles have their roots in the experiences of plantation slavery, indentureship, and the struggles to build new types of communities in the aftermath of these systems of unfreedom. Thus, efforts to make cooperatives, mutual aid societies, self-help, all of these things that comprise the social and solidarity economy, efforts to make them more responsive to market signals have the potential to destabilize the very foundations and radical traditions upon which many institutions and organizations are based. So that's kind of where I'm going to go in this talk. So I don't know, but I'm assuming that quite a few of you are aware that the social and solidarity economy refers to a kind of myriad of institutions. There's no one fixed and agreed upon definition, but it refers to a whole slew of institutions that are guided by principles and practices that value cooperation, reciprocity, redistribution, solidarity, ethics, and democratic self-management. It includes cooperatives, mutual aid societies, self-help groups, not-for-profits, foundations, and social enterprises, of which I'll be focusing a little bit more as the talk goes on. Social and solidarity economies exist at every level within the economic system, and they influence all manner of economic exchange, including finance, production, distribution, and governance. Now, while SSEs have existed since time immemorial, many people have recognized that, their value to the functioning of the global economy and their capacity to offer an alternative vision for social life on the planet has only recently come to the attention of policymakers and scholars in the West. So this is not to say that there was no recognition ever before of the value of SSEs before 1990, but rather, as Priscilla Ferrier reminds us, that business scholars and Western policymakers have only just begun to recognize their value. Indeed, as early as the 1980s, feminist scholars documented the important role that the social and solidarity economy played in the social reproduction of societies subject to austerity policies. Scholars like Swashti Mitter, or below, which in my slide is Lourdes Beneria. Some of you may remember these scholars. They're still alive. Well, Swashti Mitter is not, but they're still there. And they spent a lot of time paying attention to the practices of everyday life. They documented how communities collectively organized to address eroding levels of access to employment, health, food, housing. They emphasize the importance of these practices to the health and welfare, not just of households and communities, but also to the environment. So these scholars, were writing some time ago, and they were asking us to think, in the case of Lourdes Beneria, to think about economics as if people mattered. Repeatedly, they insisted that we needed to give greater recognition and support to the economies of care that founded or underpins so much of the social and solidarity economy. So the point I'm trying to make is that even in the 1980s, we sort of know this. We knew this, and this came from scholars largely from the global South, who were experiencing their own form of austerity, as was the case in 2008. Many of you might be more familiar with this model, and these are the writings of J.K. Gibson Graham. Their writings were very illustrative also of the way that it's illustrative of the way that feminists have sought to bring attention to the value that marginalized and often invisible non-market, unpaid economic activities bring to market economies. They argued that by restricting our definition of the economy, many of you are familiar with this argument, to the market economy, we obscure the vastly different ways that exchange is negotiated, the different ways that labor is performed, and importantly, the diverse ways in which we could produce a kinder, gentler, and just world. Their concept of community economies, economies that put ethical negotiations of our interdependence with each other and the environment center stage, captures the range of exchange relations that policymakers now identify as key strengths of the social and solidarity economies. But for me, I've always been a little troubled with the community economies literature. I think what is missing in the diverse economies literature is an explicit recognition of the place of racial dispossession, racial memory, and freedom struggles in the formation and sustainability of these non-market forms. What I think is missing is an attention to what Sylvia Wynter calls that area of experience called the New World, or alternatively, the experience of the New World, of New World coloniality, from which the Caribbean radical traditions that I want to talk a little bit about that underpin the social and solidarity economy from which they emerged. It's my belief that without an account of the place of racial capitalist dispossession and struggle in the creation of social and solidarity economies, frameworks like that of the diverse economies appear depoliticized and unmoored from the collective consciousness and shared sense of obligation that continues to be crucial building blocks in the different modes of survival and ways of being fully human that sustain social and solidarity economies. Sorry about that. Sorry, I'm now moving through slides like I don't care. No, here we go. So the current embrace of social enterprise, which is the title of this talk in particular, I think threatens the instrumental role of radical consciousness and struggle in the activities of SSEs. And I will explain social enterprise is a specific part of the social and solidarity economy. It's not the only part, but it certainly is the part that policymakers are really focusing on. So while policymakers are acknowledging the vital role of SSEs in absorbing and accommodating and adapting to crisis, they tend to do so within the vocabulary of the market economy, emphasizing qualities that prevent SSEs from making a more sustained contribution to social life, rather than really focusing on some of the obstacles and strategies that states and public institutions have historically put in the path of social and solidarity institutions. So it's becoming all too common for policy documents to portray social and solidarity economies as restricted in their capacity to effect change without acknowledging the broader contexts within which SSEs function, and in particular, the retreat of the state from providing for social need. Rather than exploring ways for government and private institutions to assist SSEs in expanding their social mission, much of the existing and emerging policy literature has tended instead to focus on delineating the market conditions for SSEs to thrive. So what I want to do now, having just sort of laid out, this is a terrain within which I'm thinking about social enterprise within the context of a renewed attention to social and solidarity economies. What I want to do now is to go back a little bit in time to history. I want to turn to Jamaica, and I want to illustrate some of the ways that the turn towards social enterprise is obscuring the racial histories, racial traditions, and importantly, the relations of trust and obligation that have been crucial to the success of a good many social and solidarity economies on the island. So what can be learned from the historic practices of Caribbean populations to establish lives and livelihoods within landscapes of restricted possibility during and after slavery? You know, up until 1838, when slavery was abolished, throughout the British Caribbean, most racialized workers were dispossessed of their capacity to sell their own labor. Their labor power was owned, it was commodified, it was consumed by others through the legal institution of chattel slavery and slave-sanctioned and state-sanctioned violence. Enslaved people in Jamaica could neither own land nor property because they were property. And because of the peculiarity of chattel, they were dispossessed of ownership in themselves and their children who were born the property of others too. In such environments of unfreedom, it's difficult to envisage how cultures of reciprocity, sharing, or trust could have emerged. Africans transported to the region rarely shared the same ethnicity, let alone language, and over time had experiences that were vastly different from the Creole population born and raised on the island. But a strong sense of community did emerge from the plantation experience, one that emerged from the spaces where people could congregate outside of the watchful eye of plantation owners and overseers. Philosopher Sylvia Wynter, who I mentioned before, among others, identifies the space of the plot, the only place on the plantation industrial complex where enslaved people could reclaim their personhood, as a space where the earliest evidence of a social economy emerged. The plot, sometimes also called the provision ground, was land set aside on the plantation for enslaved people to grow the food that they ate. While slave owners devised provision grounds in order to save money, because of course your property was producing its own food, these spaces unknowingly provided enslaved people with access to time and space that was both within the order dictated by the plantation and yet detached from it. And because of this contradiction, provision grounds and gardens allowed slaves to develop, and I'm quoting here from Sylvia Wynter, an extensive and even impressive range of independent production and marketing activities that became instrumental over time to their ability to survive the brutality of the system, to develop social and political solidarities, and for a minuscule minority to save enough money to buy their freedom. The plot, as Sylvia Wynter observes then, was the slaves' area of escape from the plantation. It was an area of experience which reinvented and therefore perpetuated an alternative worldview, an alternative consciousness to that of the plantation. This worldview was marginalized by the plantation, but it never fully destroyed it. Provision grounds enabled unfree peoples of African descent to reaffirm themselves, because as Wynter explains, the ideology of the provision ground and the culture based on it rehumanized the object property relations that were created through plantation ideology. I use this quote a lot just because I really like it, and so I find every opportunity to share it with people. But you know, that liberatory and community building space that now defines the social and solidarity economies in places like Jamaica is captured in the work of Michel Rouf-Trillo when he says, time used on the provision ground was also slave-controlled time to a large extent. It was time to create culture knowingly or unknowingly. It was time to develop new practices of labor cooperation, reminiscent of, yet different from African models of work. It created time to talk across the fences to a passing neighbor, or to cross the fences themselves and fish in the adjacent waters, time indeed to develop mode of thought and codes of behavior that were to survive plantation slavery itself. This is a powerful quote for me. It's a longer quote. I've chopped it down a little for time, but it speaks a little to the ingredients behind much of the social and solidarity economies even today. The cultures of cooperation and reciprocity that emerged from the provision ground provided the foundation, as I said, for the social economies created after emancipation and the formal end of slavery. So, emancipation presented a new set of challenges for people who had been formerly chattel, as the ties that they had once had to the provision grounds were now broken. And the colonial government, in a desperate bid to protect large-scale plantation agriculture, sought to discourage small-scale peasant farming through discriminatory laws that made it really very costly to acquire land. Rich planters also made ownership near impossible by charging extortionate rents to those who sought to become independent farmers on their own terms. So partnerships between local Black congregations, deacons, and ministers, and a variety of white evangelical missionaries circumvented this obstacle through the creation of what are called free villages. Free villages were tracts of land that were purchased by Baptist and Quaker intermediaries that were divided into parcels and subsequently sold to newly freed farmers, or settlers as they were called, not quite in the same usage as it would be in Canada. And these newly freed farmers would often pool their financial resources in order to purchase these subdivided small freeholds. In 1842, approximately 150 to 2,000 free villages were established on approximately 100,000 acres of land. And that facilitated the construction of approximately 3,000 villages. By 1845, approximately a third of all formerly enslaved populations had located on these new settlements. So the concept of the free village is perhaps one of the earliest examples of a Jamaican post-emancipation solidarity economy, whose spiritual groundings and commitment to building family and community was closely tied to the freedom struggles and aspirations of these newly freed people. While many of the forms of self-help and community practices found in free villages had their roots in the social relationships that had developed in the provision grounds, they later became crucial, these self-help practices, to the success of Jamaica's cooperative movement. So some of Jamaica's earliest cooperatives really have their roots in these free villages. Practices like jointly purchasing land and reselling it to members, or pledging pooled land as a security for each other, or exchanging labor through practices such as morning sport, land day, and work partnerships, or throwing in a hand in a rotating savings and credit association, were enacted by people who were committed to the tacit rules that govern these collective exchanges, rules that emphasize trust, responsibility, and accountability to the collective. Now, while these cooperative practices, these very early forms of a social economy, were crucial to the creation of an independent peasantry, their collective efforts were never really fully integrated into the economy in ways that might have supported industrial scale agricultural production of the sort that we associate with socialist cooperatives, those very large scale ventures that we associate with China, the Soviet Union at the time, etc. In fact, as Elsie LeFranc Riley observed back in 1978, any interest in agricultural cooperatives held by the colonial government seemed motivated by their desire to divest themselves of any responsibility for the extreme lack of available credit for small farmers and to reduce requests for grants and aid. She argues that the interests of the colonial government and large land-owning elites to keep small farmers small explains why, despite their popularity, agricultural cooperatives were never able to expand in ways that challenged the structural inequalities that continue to define agriculture in Jamaica even today. In the 1970s, under the Prime Minister Michael Manley's governing, the state made an effort to expand the number of agricultural cooperatives. And it was part of a program called a larger program of land reform that was aimed at addressing the deeply uneven distribution of land. And this, of course, was a legacy of the plantation and that dominance of that tiny elite over the majority of fertile soils. So, you know, the vast majority of small farmers found themselves on plots of less than 2 hectares of land, usually of poor quality and usually on a hillside, whereas 3% of landowners controlled 62% of the land on plots of approximately 900 hectares, and usually it was the best and fertile land. So the idea of land reform in the 1970s by the Manley government was built upon this principle of trying to bring access to land through programs of land leasing, but also through the creation of pioneer farms. Now, pioneer farms, I'm going to explain what those are. And you know, I searched for a really good image of what the land lease programs of the 1970s looked like, and I could only find this kind of ghostly apparition, and it is a haunting of another period, so maybe that's a good reason for using this image. But pioneer farms aim to settle young people on lands that lay idle and to train them in cooperative management in the hope that their engagement in agriculture would help to reduce the problem of high rates of youth unemployment, that it would reduce crime, as well as the island's high level of dependence on imported food, which unfortunately still persists today, where over 99% of everything consumed on this island is imported. But the state efforts to develop cooperatives in the agricultural sector were largely unsuccessful, I would say, for a range of reasons, but a primary one of which included lack of access to finance. So I don't know if you're all following, but lack of access to finance is a continued thread of a problem from the very early formation of this post-plantation economy till the 1970s. The reluctance of commercial banks to lend money to cooperatives continues to this day, and the relative insufficiency of government funds made it difficult in the 1970s for farming cooperatives to expand. So by the 1980s, when most of the debt-stricken governments across the Caribbean began to adopt neoliberal policies aimed at liberalizing and privatizing agricultural land for agro-export, these agricultural cooperatives became oriented more towards marketing crops for overseas markets than for supporting small farming and sustainable local food production. However, you know, despite the near absence, of state support, there were a number of organizations that were notably successful in maintaining the principles of cooperation, reciprocity, redistribution, solidarity, ethics, all of which is so crucial to the idea of a social economy, and at the same time generating resources to sustain themselves. So somewhere in the absence of the state and the absence of interest by the private sector in the 1990s emerged these social economies, you know, that really functioned on goodwill and air. And one of them I've spoken about before, quite a bit I've written about, is an organization called Life Yard. whose social mission is to introduce young Jamaicans to their culture through art, agriculture, and education. And this is an amazing, it's located in one of the poorest parts of Jamaica. And it has sustained itself as a social, it calls itself a social enterprise. I would call it more of a mutual aid and self-help group. But they've been remarkably successful since 2014. Life Yard is run by a group of young Rastafarians in one of the, as I said, the poorest neighborhoods. They draw very, very heavily on the practices of collective dialogue called reasoning and groundings, of respect for nature and natural living, which they describe as livity, and a rejection of Western epistemes, which they call Babylon. And these are tenets, crucial tenets of Rastafarianism in terms of how people live with each other and with the land. And so this young group that's part of Life Yard that, you know, have as their mission bringing culture to young people, they embody many of these practices that characterize the Black radical traditions of Rastafarianism and Garveyism. And in all of their mutual aid programs, they run school breakfast programs, they have urban farming, they run community tourism, largely for overseas tourists interested in their project. They have an arts and crafts foundation. All of these things, all of these activities are guided by these principles. Now, while much of the initial success of Life Yard, which I've spoken about because it's connected to a mural project called Paint Jamaica, but much of the initial success of Life Yard came from its online presence and its global crowdfunding appeal. But their other activities, the urban farm, the vegan bar, the juice bar, community tourism, all of these are income generating activities that have been equally successful. All of which to say is that social economies can be income generating, and they can be resource generating without necessarily having the overhang of an expectation that they are driven by market logics, because Life Yard is not. Another organization, and I just am really touching on them briefly, is the Mustard Seed Community. It's a not-for-profit. It's existed since 1978, and it was established by Monsignor Gregory Ramkisoon, who you can see here, who incidentally was a geographer. He actually taught me when I was an undergraduate for some time in the early 1980s, to give my age away. So the Mustard Seed Community now has branches in Latin America and Africa. It continues to draw on a Christian missionary tradition embedded in liberation theology. And what it does as a program is to meet the needs of adults and children with a range of developmental and physical disabilities. So the Mustard Seed Community has always also had an income generating part of what they do. They've for years run a ceramics manufacturing factory for the last 25 years. And that has been used, they've plowed that back into their establishment in order to provide resources for to supplement the $500 to $600 million that they raise in funds every year. So, you know, again, an example of a social economy, an institution that is part of a social economy that does not have profit as its major motive. It is not a social enterprise, or at least up until recently, it was not, but really had the social mission as the thing that led its activities. So what I want to do now is just to shift tack a little bit. I've told you a bit about where I think the history of the social economy is embedded in the plantation and the way that people made themselves into becoming human or more humanized. I focused on how that idea of a social economy has been challenged historically in Jamaica, largely because of an ongoing racial script that creates or has constructed Black peoples as less able for institutions to want to finance, to put that inelegantly. But what I want to do now is to just focus on this emergence of something called social enterprise as a part of the social and solidarity economy, the embrace by a number of institutions, and what that means for how that, or what that looks like in Jamaica. So, whereas there is a whole world of social and solidarity economies, institutions like the World Bank, the EU, USAID have really just focused on one part, the social and solidarity enterprise, the social enterprise, which really is about trying to generate or help enable the growth of organizations that use commercial and business strategies for the benefit of society or the environment. So social enterprises are slightly different. They exist in a number of corporate forms. Some of them are not-for-profits that are revenue generating, but others are for-profit businesses that have a social goal. But at their core, and this is important to take away, social enterprises are organizations that are governed by business principles. So organizations like USAID, the EU, the British Council are really actively helping Jamaica's social enterprise development strategy, providing technical assistance for them to become more inclusive businesses, to provide seed finance, as is the case with USAID, to help bring into fruition social entrepreneurs that are more proficient and attuned to the principles of enterprise. The Jamaican government has completely responded to these incentives. It also has helped or is trying to enable the growth of this development strategy of social enterprise by creating the juridical infrastructure that's needed for social enterprises to be recognized, to have legal status. So with the assistance of a number of other Western organizations like Social Enterprise UK or ESLA, which is a global network of people trying to reshape the legal systems for social impact, the Jamaican government has received information on the best practices of governments all around the world in trying to develop a legal definition and trying to create the context for the expansion of social enterprise. One may wonder what could be so problematic about receiving assistance or learning the best practices of other countries that have also developed policies and legal practices to support social enterprises. What I find problematic is the foreclosure that strategies like the adoption of best practices for social enterprise bring to our capacity to imagine and support the social economy. What I find problematic is the occlusion of the deep racial histories within which the Jamaican social economy is embedded. And what I find egregious is the implicit devaluation of the knowledge that communities that practice collective forms of provisioning, financing, and distributing could bring to the table. I believe that in embracing the best practices of the social enterprise development strategy, what the Jamaican government has done is to become a willing subject of the specific neoliberal governance techniques that best practices and legal tweaks enable. For as Wendy Brown observed so many years ago, unlike violence, dictatorial command, or even overt political platforms, best practices and legal tweaks operate as a form of soft power that draws on consensus and buy-in, enabling neoliberal logics to govern a sophisticated common sense. That the state has embraced the social enterprise model is not altogether surprising. given Jamaica's long-standing difficulty in attracting investment capital and the immediate benefits that come from foreign international donor funding that gives resources for startup initiatives. But far more problematic is the way in which, in order to justify the need for a social enterprise model, representatives have problematized the existing social economy, drawing on much of the same racializing rhetoric to do so as colonial governments or the colonial government or commercial banks so many years before had done. So for example, while government representatives recognize that social enterprises long predate the current global initiative, they simultaneously problematize it. And they problematize it by describing the social enterprises in Jamaica as highly informal, fragmented, with people defining it to suit their own purpose in ways that don't accord with international best practice. Other circulating discourses link an expanded social enterprise agenda to crime reduction and cast the social economy organizations that already exist as lacking in management skills or overly dependent on grant funding. Many of these critiques echo the concerns that have historically made it really difficult for example, farming cooperatives to access finance. Now, I think it's necessary to draw attention to the particular strategy of power, what Denise Ferreira da Silva calls the analytic of raciality that policymakers are deploying to justify exclusionary practices without explicitly drawing on racial categories to do so. So while policymakers continue to center the non-literacy of poor communities, poor financial management, lack of leadership as key reasons for the failure of cooperatives to be financially viable, and other social economies to be not financially viable, meaning needing the assistance of the US aid, the EU, the World Bank to help them to learn to do so, anti-colonial scholars might simply just argue that this sort of rhetoric taps into a structure of knowledge that understands Blackness as to be a departure from modernity, and one that naturalizes discourses that cast Black populations as too lacking in monetary responsibility and business acumen to be entrusted with access to capital. So I just want to talk a little bit about this one document, because this is the only document, to be honest, that everyone's drawing on to understand what does social enterprise look like in Jamaica. So in 2017, the British Council, USAID, and FHI 360, which is a nonprofit organization, they formed a partnership, and they had a project that was designed to map the size, scale, and potential of social enterprise in Jamaica. And I think just looking at some of the findings offers some indication of the challenges that abound when the vocabulary of entrepreneurialism, financial innovation, and profit become part of the mission of serving people over profit. So the British Council USAID mapping project, they surveyed 166 organizations, 126 of which were considered to be social enterprises because they had a declared social mission and that they derived 30% or more of their income from sources other than grants and donations, and they reinvested their surpluses back into the organization. So that's the definition of a social enterprise in Jamaica, which is actually quite different from the definition in other parts of the world, where a social enterprise is defined, or it is expected that a social enterprise should derive at least 50% of its income from sources other than grants and donations. Of the social enterprises in the survey, most of them are really quite small. 70% earned less than 5,000 US dollars a year. Many of them were dependent on external funding from grants, 43% of them were, in-kind contributions, 44%, and donations, 38%. So you're beginning to get a picture of what social enterprise looks like. It isn't quite the same as that described in much of the policy documents of like Social Enterprise UK. Many of these organizations also derived their funding from the communities they served, 30.9%, individual donors, 30.1%, and to a lesser extent, state agencies, local foundations, and notably international funding agencies. This is a profile that is consistent with organizations led by a social mission. But for this survey, it was one that fell short of the expectations for social enterprise. So the report ended up recommending that Jamaican organizations really just need to have a clearer sense of what is expected of them if they choose to present themselves as social enterprises. The report says this includes a commitment to providing goods and services to earn revenue. They've got to be able to demonstrate that this is a priority, an adoption of metrics such as cost-benefit analysis and social return on investment to assess, and I'm quoting from the report, to assess their capacity to absorb resources effectively and deliver results, and their willingness to allow external partners to evaluate any assessments that they may have of value creation. That these recommendations replicate the conventions and procedures that govern for-profit businesses speaks, I think, volumes to the challenges that these organizations will face if they choose to take on the legal status of social enterprise. And I suspect that many of them will simply not. Now, in drawing attention to the way that market logics have begun to encroach on social and solidarity economies, I don't mean to suggest that social organizations should eschew activities aimed at generating an income. In fact, most not-for-profits have engaged in income-generating activities for some time in order to survive. But there is a difference between engaging in markets to enable and expand a social mission and having markets govern the worth or value of an organization's social mission. And in the current policy landscape, the embrace of the social enterprise model is increasingly shifting the balance of power towards markets rather than communities. Now, I'm going to cut for time because I wanted to talk a little bit, which I won't, about the mustard seed community. They have, I don't say drunk the Kool-Aid because that suggests I have a position here, but they have gone ahead with many of the criteria for becoming a social enterprise in the eyes of USAID and the EU, and that includes expanding their mission to include things like fish ponds, an organic egg production facility, pig and vegetable farms, a bakery, an abattoir. I mean, it's dizzying all the things that they want to do. And they argue that it's very necessary if they are to survive. So, you know, in the eyes of the state, this mustard seed community is a success story because it's proof, apparently, that a social enterprise model can alleviate poverty. But in reality, most social enterprises, most social economy organizations in Jamaica have to depend on external funds in order to survive. They have to depend on charities, fundraisers, donations. Some of them, like Lifeyard, do it really well. You can see their GoFundMe page and how much money they make in order to survive, because that's the only place where social support and financial support comes from. And it is the level of trust in their social mission, with their roots in Caribbean radical traditions founded on Rastafarianism, Garveyism, liberation theology, that continue to actually sustain public support for organizations like Mustard Seed and Life Yard. So it's not really clear whether other social enterprises, especially those that are young and new and importantly not grounded in histories of coloniality and dispossession, whether they can achieve the sort of success that Life Yard and Mustard Seed have. Without a deeper grounding and connection to the long histories of struggle in community, it's not clear how some of the emerging social enterprises like this one, I've got a little picture of it here, Def Can. It's a coffee social enterprise that trains young people with hearing disabilities to become coffee baristas in coffee shops that they own and operate. It's not really clear that this sort of social enterprise can sustain itself beyond the seed monies that have brought them into fruition. So I want to just conclude. Doreen Massey and Michael Rustin, they remind us that economics is not simply a technical matter beyond politics. And for this same reason, economic policy should be more than just a set of individual policies addressing disparate issues. Each policy should be an expression of a wider narrative, an underlying political rationality, and the interests and values that they implicitly articulate. So there's something really quite fundamental about the profit motive. Profits, I think, are quite antithetical to the social mission of most social and solidarity or institutions, or at least it should be. The social enterprise model is therefore a contradictory one because its efforts to make cooperatives, mutual aid societies, self-help groups more responsive to market metrics rely upon logics that are contradictory to the social mission that these organizations hold themselves. Founded on principles of respect, care, reciprocity, and solidarity, social economies utilize a vocabulary that speaks to identities, roles, relationships among people and places. And that vocabulary is certainly at odds with the neoliberal rationalities that currently hold dominance over our understanding of the way that the economic world naturally is. So ultimately, to question the social enterprise model is to question the place that markets should occupy in the making of societies. It is to question why market exchange has become imperative to all our social relationships, and to resist the assumption that market goals are commensurate with social justice. To question the social enterprise model is also to assert that histories matter. And in the context of Jamaica, the long histories of struggle against racial dispossession matter to the credibility of social organizations and the success of their social missions. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was actually just riveting, but also so interesting because I think it gets at the core question we have to ask ourselves across the world, which is, should market logics be the rationale or even like the guiding principle behind things we do? It's like a real question. We sort of take it for granted, but yeah. So that was just like really evocative, and I thank you. And I would like to open up the floor to questions. So I have a question here in the chat. From Warren Waters to everyone, any coincidence that your two modern SE examples, Mustard Seed and Life Yard, are religion-based that also rejected faith in the market logic? Does this mean that one faith must replace another faith for alternative social power relations to work?
Okay, I'm trying to think through, a response to this question. Yes, Mustard Seed and Life Yard are religion-based, but they're more than that. So, it's not the Anglican Church. It's, they are very much, especially Life Yard, and I would say more so than Mustard Seed, they are embedded in what many call a Black radical tradition about how to make do with very little, how to maintain community in the face of persecution, the radical tradition about how to survive when everything in a system actually tries to remove one's common humanity. So it's more than just, religion based. It is about some fundamental principles about what makes us human that people actually do recognize. Like Life Yard is as successful as it is because the communities that it serves recognize that it actually isn't part of a market economy, that in actual fact, its principles are grounded in Rastafarian principles, but they're also the principles of the Black radical tradition. So does it mean that one faith must replace another faith for alternative social power relations to work? I'd like to put that differently. I would say it means that we need to put value to these alternative ways of imagining the world, which at the moment are occluded or they don't really come to life because of the dominance of the logic of the market. That sort of language so makes it difficult to understand that Rastafarianism has principles. And I want to just add, I didn't talk about it, but in the context of Jamaica, people who embrace the social enterprise development model tend to be largely middle class, tend to be largely Creole nationalists. And they're very different from the poorest of communities that don't quite have the fervor of wanting to be in line with international best practices as the IMF, the World Bank, the EU ask. And I see there is another question. How can any social organization continue to exist unless it earns more than it consumes, which is profit? Good question. Well, one thing that we do have to think through is how is it that Life Yard and the Mustard Seed community have been as successful as they have? And they actually are not earning institutions. They are institutions that when they collect any sort of money, it's not a profit. It is actually just revenue. It's revenue that is plowed back in. So there is a difference between profit, which is the extraction of surplus in and above the value produced, and revenue, which is about having monies that you can actually utilize in the, in your everyday activities. I hope that made it clear, Warren, but thank you for the question. It's a good one.
I think that really does answer the question. I invite other people to ask questions. Paul.
Hi, Paul. Good to see you.
Hi, Beverly. Good to see you too. Yeah. So as you may know, Beverly, yeah, we've chatted before. So your early work on Caribbean tourism, absolutely fundamental for my way in to think of Jamaican tourism and my dissertation research. So it's really good to see you maintaining the focus on Jamaica, and it's excellent talk. I think two things really struck me. I thought your critique of the diverse economies model was excellent in terms of Ken Burns' iceberg model. And I mean, I've always enjoyed the J.K. Graham, approach to getting beyond a capitalocentric view of economies and pluralizing economic and social relations. So that was, for me, really good. And what struck me was, in a sense, the bottom half, the submerged part of the iceberg, then becomes this almost, kind of white fantasy of harmony and good things. And so the antidote then would be to, racialize that in terms of the various violences, to contextualize these things. So I wonder if you've received any feedback for that critique from those scholars, and there's quite a number of them, I guess. So for me, that was a really excellent intervention. And secondly, so it's been a while since I was in Jamaica doing research, but during the early 2000s, community tourism was pretty nascent. I think Mandeville was one of the kind of hubs in the center of this kind of new attempt to be more positive in avoiding the traps of the all-inclusive conventional tourism. So I was interested if you could talk more about how Life Yard interfaces with community tourism, insofar as, is it another example of the tourists that bust in, mainly from North America, Western Europe, kind of white tourists bust in for a kind of brief tour and spectacle, or is it more complex? Is it more kind of, go an attempt to really bring to bear the fruits of possible encounters with the tourists and so on? So that would be my second question. But again, Bev, thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you. So when you started asking your question, I was intrepid because I thought you were going to say, how dare you ask questions? The diverse economies framework. So I haven't actually, I don't know if any of the folks I haven't published significantly with that particular critique yet, but it is one that took me a long while to get there because I like so much the diverse economies framework. It makes sense to me. I teach it, but I always had a slight feeling of something, I can't put my finger on it, but something feels really white. And I really actually couldn't articulate it beyond that. But I think I've understood it now by looking at social economies in Jamaica, what makes them work, the ones that do, and recognizing that there's a politics of struggle, which is kind of weird because the diverse economies thesis is political, right? It is trying to push boundaries, but there is a depoliticizing of the actual types of struggles. And I think in particular, the work of coloniality in those struggles, it's sort of just not there in the literature. So no, I haven't heard back yet, but I hope that, maybe I will have a chance to speak with Catherine and have a sense of, or others, what they think of that idea. With regard to community tourism, I can only say this, and any of you who have an opportunity, just look at Lifeyard or Paint Jamaica. They have an extensive online presence. The area where the Lifeyard is located is in a community that very few people, including local people, would ever walk through. And if you ever go, it is fascinating that there are tourists, they're walking on foot, because, and they're walking through neighborhoods that for many would be scary. But their entry into the community is on the community's terms. So this isn't, the Jamaican government has no say in this. The tourism board probably would tell you not to go there, but they have managed to, and I think it's their online presence and the magnitude of what they're trying to achieve that has a lot of well wishes. And so people go to learn. They don't go to just see, but they go to learn. So literally you'll see lots of pictures, and I've been there, of people who are trying to understand Rastafarianism, for example. So they will sit and they will be in a round of reasoning and groundings to understand how Rastafarians understand the world, understand Babylon, Western epistemologies, so it happens, but it's not in the curated way that the Jamaican state has tried to, organize what tourism looks like, even at the level of community. And I hope that kind of helps, but yeah, they are quite different.
Thanks, Beth.
Thanks. I see a comment here. Thank you, Christine. Sean, if I could talk about the relationship between the Jamaican diaspora and the continuation of the traditional practices. Well, yes, I can. One of the amazing things, and it's research that I actually want to do, but haven't really started yet, is to look at the way in which the diaspora is trying to do exactly the same thing, trying to build social economies that utilize these traditional practices. My colleague, Carolyn Shanaz Hussain, has written extensively on rotating savings and credit associations, and the way she has a term that she uses, lady bankers, the way that these informal folks that, traditional banks don't pay any attention to. And even at the moment in Canada, the the program for trying to expand Black entrepreneurialism in Canada. I don't know if anyone's been following that, but the amount of money that the government is giving to in the wake of Black Lives Matter and the ferment of the summer of 2019, I think it is, that there are now monies to try to encourage Black entrepreneurialism, but so few of them actually involve these banker ladies who for years have been using what some people call susu or box hand, but they're rotating savings associations where people put small amounts every month and it rotates. And then one person can accumulate an amount, and that's a slow way, but it's a sure way of having access to finance. And so Carolyn writes a lot about these practices as they exist in the diaspora, and not just the Jamaican diaspora, mind you. These practices exist in many types of diaspora. They're called Hagbad, or if by Ethiopians, etc. So yeah, there is a relationship. How that works in terms of the social enterprise model, I really know less about, because I know even here in Canada, the social enterprise model through social impact is also top of the thinking of the state. But that relationship with diaspora in Canada, I know more about it in terms of in the informal forms of saving and those practices of solidarity that have really deep roots. They exist right here in places like Canada too.
I'm looking to see if there are more questions. And I don't see any, so. Oh, hold on.
Live question. Oh wait, Aaron, you can let Aaron go, and I'll ask after.
Oh, there's another one too. Aaron's raised their hand. You guys go ahead.
Us guys.
You guys, yeah.
Sorry, I've been trying to navigate all the technology and many of us in a room on a small screen, so apologies for the confusion. Thank you so much, Bev, for your talk. It's really wonderful just to hear what your thinking is. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak. You're here. Yeah, here is in this room. Wishing it was in person. I just wanted to think a little bit and ask you a bit more about how you're taking up winter in your work. As I was like, right now, May and I are co-teaching a class on geographies of conquest and liberation. And we've been having a lot of conversations on the plantation and the plot and the sort of,
Great.
So it's just really inspiring to hear how you're using it in your work. But you were making me think a bit about plantation geographies in particular, and how Clyde Woods theorized it. And it makes me wonder about where is it that you see the World Bank, the IMF, and these other sort of transnational global actors, what role they're playing within that spatial analytic? Like, can we think of them as sort of a figure or a mechanism of the plantation bloc in a global sense? And so sort of related to that, what would the sort of these plantation analytics look like in Jamaica? How might the presence of the World Bank and these other global actors push the scale of how plantation geographies have been theorized in the US, for example? So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Big question, but a great question, and one for which I have only parts of thoughts to contribute. So it took me a really long time to recognize that, hey, Sylvia Wynter had written this manuscript that clearly circulates in places that are not easily located, which is her opus Black Metamorphosis. And in reading it, I was part of a reading group reading it. I was blown away, really blown away by how much political economy was in her early work, how much she actually reformulated how Marx thought of the birth of capitalism, and the way in which she challenged, challenged the orthodoxy of the way that capitalism, the narrative of capitalism, the way in which she challenged it by saying, but you have to think about the way in which race and racialized bodies outside of humanity were so important to that logic. So the half of her book, and it's a 400-page manuscript, the first half of it is straight political economy. So, you know, I use bits of it in my own work because I find it gives me the frame that allows me to think about the continuity of plantation logics in the Caribbean, because that's where she's writing about, you know, in the book. But also it allows for a space for thinking about how the value of racialized peoples continues to be defined by institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. I mean, that beginning couple of chapters helps to do that. It helps to give the logic, which then actually became taken up in world systems theory, of a whole global system, very reliant on differential value and differential forms of humanity given to particular groups of people. So Winter's work, especially the plot and the plantation, and I've stuck very close to that. I've used less of the sort of North American iterations of it, partly because, hey, she already wrote it for the Caribbean, even though people forget that the Caribbean is actually a significant part of that work, that I tend to use it. I still tend to use Sylvia Winter's work to help me to think through what is the modern day iteration of the plantation. And the modern day iteration of the plantation is very hard to actually see that because it's not agricultural based. It, you know, if you're really looking for it, it's diffused through things like finance. And it's really what's carried my work to finance, because it is like the plantation anew, but in through a very different language and not in material objects. I also find Sylvia Winter's work, which is Michel Roth-Triot's work, which many people in geography are taking up with the plot-plantation dichotomy. The fact that the plot indicates where spaces to be rehumanized are located. That's kind of what the plot is. That's what the plot is all about in the plot and plantation dichotomy. And so the real challenge is to take Sylvia Winter further, to scale her up, as it were, to think through how does that dichotomy, what does it look like in an already globalized world of financialized flows, where agriculture and you know, specific spaces like the plantation, which is the center of agricultural production, they're no longer dominant. So I know that's not so coherent, all of that, but to say that there are elements of that plot and plantation that I think we all need to try and hold on to, and to see if we can see it, because often it's harder to see it. It's harder to see how the World Bank functions as, you know, an agent of the plantation when they're saying things like, we just want to support institutions that have a social mission. You know, there's a kind of blurring of what the plot and the plantation looks like. And that's our challenge. But I would say anyone that can get hold of Black Metamorphosis, it's an amazing oeuvre in terms of the work. Thank you. And I hope I answered some of what you were asking.
I think Erin has a question.
So I moved from Canada to Oakland Bay Area, and learning about their whole system of the rise of the Black Power movement, and then the sort of classic devaluing language of trying to push traditional economies and ways of communities of sustaining themselves really strongly towards this neocolonialism model. And so that then in turn pushed towards predatory lending practices that were so prevalent until just recently. Actually, I think the Biden administration kind of came in and did this whole protection. And then listening to the same devaluing language as you explain it and saying like, no, you need to push towards this for-profit business model. You said that they are still reticent to fund projects, but do you think that that heavy like money, was a Western Union kind of style of predatory lending and pushing towards the bootstrap model, do you think that's far behind in Jamaica?
This is so complicated, and it touches on another bit of work that I've been doing, which is really how do I put this? The model is there that Western Union, or worse yet, commercial banks have made a killing of the, sweat, blood, love, tears of diasporic subjects trying to send money through the medium of remittances. So that structure is there, but I find myself also arguing against another set of systems that are going to wipe out even the ones that were problematic. And that is all of the legislation that's emerging on money laundering, anti-money laundering, and the counter-financing of terrorism. I mean, there's a whole global architecture being put in place that will make it more and more difficult. If I identified in this talk that the thread from the end of slavery until today for small social economies has always been no money, lack of finance. That hasn't changed, but what is emerging is a global architecture of finance that will make it really difficult for things like crowdfunding money to go to Jamaica. It's already difficult for even Western Union money transfer operators to circulate money from individuals sending it back home. There's a whole architecture that is destroying even these institutions that for me were already problematic because of the price, the cost, the transaction cost of sending money across borders. But even that is being destroyed. So there's a whole series of things happening at other levels, and they're a little different for the Caribbean to the extent that I don't think if you're in the United States, that the AML-CFT, which is the anti-money laundering, countering the finance of terrorism legislation, doesn't quite hit as much. But as we can see with just even the current war in Ukraine, that it is very easy to turn off the flow of money from one place to the other. And that's what's happening. So, we had predatory lending. We had a system of denial of credit. Then we wanted to give credit, but it was really expensive to move money. And now there is a possibility of literally cutting off access to money or finance altogether. And that is what's happening in Jamaica at the moment. If any of you went to Jamaica and you had $10 US and you went to a commercial bank to change that to local currency, if you didn't have your passport or an extensive history of your financial transactions, they wouldn't take it. And that is the nature of a global architecture that has yet to have a name put to it. And that's why it's so important to think with Sylvia Winter, because she reminds us that it's not just technical rules. It is about a historical denial of the capacity of certain types of people to be understood as sufficiently human, sufficiently responsible, that you can remove you can remove the supports that make life possible.
Thank you very, very much. I really, really enjoyed your talk. Learned a lot, especially a lot of things about Jamaica that I absolutely did not know. So thank you.
I want to thank you as well, Beverly. That was just a very moving, evocative, and also like just full of stuff. Like Erin said, we didn't know. So I on behalf of the whole department, I really thank you deeply and appreciate your time. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly enjoyed the questions. Some of them I will take with me and keep thinking about them. But thank you all very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for coming, everyone. Okay, we're gonna let you go. We know it's later there. And thank you again. And I will email you. Take care. Bye.
Take care all. Bye.
Bye.